I will go in order of the panelists who will speak. To my immediate right is Rob Lee, who is a senior fellow here at FPRI. To my further right is Phil Wasielewski. Did I pronounce that right? Wasielewski. Thank you. Sorry, I always screw that one up. The director of FPRI Center for the Study of Intelligence and Non-Traditional Warfare. And he was also a former paramilitary case officer with a 31-year career in the CIA. And then to my left here is Mitchell Orenstein, who is a professor of Russia and East European Studies at the University of Pennsylvania, author of the book Lands in Between, and also a senior fellow with us here at FPRI. So we're going to go in order from Rob to Phil to Mitchell. And so, Rob, the floor is yours to kick us off.
Okay, great. Everyone can hear me okay, right? Okay. So I guess I'll give a brief kind of overview of where we're at in the war right now, and then kind of move on from there. So essentially, since last summer, Ukraine conducted a large-scale offensive. That offensive was unsuccessful. It was unsuccessful for a variety of reasons, but one of which was that the Russian military in 2023 reconstituted. It managed to recruit a large number of new volunteers. It made up for some of its manpower problems it faced in 2022. It built very strong defenses across the south and other parts of occupied areas. And it also adapted in a number of different ways. So it improved its dynamic targeting abilities. It improved its number of precision-guided munitions. It has increased production of a lot of ammunition, different types of equipment. And basically, Russia put itself in a stronger position to defend and hold the territory that of last summer when Ukraine was trying to breach through and make its way to the Sea of Azov. Since basically the fall of 2023, I would say that the offensive largely culminated probably about September. Since the fall of 2023, Ukraine has faced three main issues. The first one is manpower. The second one is fortifications. And the third one was the lack of ammunition or equipment. Fortifications, I guess I won't go in order. Ukraine has strong fortifications on the front line of defenses, but it didn't have the same kind of defense in depth that Russia built. So the secondary, tertiary, additional lines, it didn't necessarily have that well built, which meant that when Russia breaches the initial front line, they can often kind of advance further on than they could before. This is more of an issue because Russia had a number of advantages this year. And so building better fortifications is one way to mitigate or compensate for Russian artillery advantage and the threat from Russian glide bombs and other things. Ukraine has been working on this since last October. They are building fortifications, so they have improved the situation somewhat, but they were a little bit behind the curve. The other big issue when the offensive ended is that Ukraine overextended. So the offensive culminated because Ukraine ran out of infantry. It didn't have enough soldiers to continue the offensive. This happened about September, October, and Ukraine has struggled to replace its losses ever since. And this happened at the same time that Russia was able to recruit a large number of volunteers. We're somewhere about 30,000 a month in 2023, going into 2024. That gave Russia a significant advantage, not just an artillery ammunition advantage, not just an aviation advantage, but also a manpower advantage, which they're using in these assaults. That was quite a big issue for Ukraine, because keep in mind, this is mostly an infantry war. And so the infantrymen are holding trenches every day. And for Ukrainian infantry, a lack of manpower meant not enough people to hold frontage in trenches. It also meant not enough people to rotate. So people get exhausted over time, becomes more difficult to fight. As many of you probably know, Ukraine passed a new mobilization law 2 months ago. It went into effect in mid-May. That lowered the mobilization age from 27 to 25. It also created some greater disincentives for people who avoid mobilization and some incentives for volunteering. That happened about a month ago. My understanding is that Ukraine has improved the numbers of people that's been mobilizing. So the manpower situation will improve, but it takes time to train these people and it takes time to get them to units. So we're talking probably the real effect to be seen maybe in July or August, ideally later this fall. But we still have to keep in mind, we don't know if this is a long-term fix, right? It could be a kind of issue long-term. Manpower, I think, is maybe the most significant single factor of how this war is going to go long-term, both relative to Russia, manpower situation in Ukraine. The last issue, of course, is ammunition and equipment. And this came down mostly to the U.S. Not passing its supplemental aid package back in the fall of 2023. As we all know, that was passed 2 months ago. That ammunition is reaching Ukrainian units. Ukraine does not have parity in artillery fire. Russia produces more artillery ammunition than we do, and we're not going to reach that time anytime soon. Russia's also been receiving a large amount of ammunition from North Korea, from Iran, other places. But the extent of that advantage has been decreased, and that's significant. There are some other issues. Air defense is a really key problem for Ukraine. So this partially should affect infrastructure and energy infrastructure. Russia has had some success destroying a number of the power plants in the last few months. That's a big issue going into winter. Also, the threat from glide bombs. So Russian bombers are dropping glide bombs that can be dropped at greater ranges. That was a development in 2023. And more air defense are kind of a key capability to both protect Ukrainian cities and also protect Ukrainian ground forces up front. So those are things that are being developed right now. Overall, the ammunition situation is improving. The manpower situation is improving. But Russia has a number of advantages this year. Their defense spending is going to peak this year. I think it's 9% of GDP. It's very high. Right now, Russia still has a manpower advantage across the front line. A month ago, Russia began a new offensive in the Kharkiv area where they crossed the border. You probably know that the Biden administration recently changed its policy, allowing Ukraine to strike into Russian territory with U.S. weapons under certain conditions, mostly tied to kind of the Kharkiv region with some limitations. The Kharkiv offensive is the front there is stabilized, so the Russian forces have not advanced in a couple of weeks. But the real issue with the Kharkiv offensive was that it forced Ukraine to pull units from other parts of the front line to hold Kharkiv, and so that meant that areas near the Donbass, which is the main priority for Russia, have become a little bit more vulnerable, and Russia's made some gains in that direction. I would say Russia hasn't really capitalized that much. I think the extent of the advance of last month have not been that significant. But as we look in the next month or two, right, it's still an opportunity where Russia has advantages. They'll try and make the most of those advantages. I think a lot of those advantages later in 2024, going into 2025, will start to decrease. One of the big issues Russia has that they're running through equipment very quickly, and they have a large stockpile of tanks, armored vehicles, artillery, but they're losing a significant amount. And of course, they refurbish the best the piece of equipment that are in the best condition. And as they get into the deeper parts of stockpiles, they start pulling out things that are in worse condition. So we think that in 2025, these equipment issues are going to be a growing problem for Russia, and that probably Russian offensive potential will degrade. And I think Ukraine will have a better chance at holding back further advances going into next year.
Thanks, Rob. Phil, I was hoping you could expand it out a little bit to talk about keeping with this organization's history, the geopolitics, and bringing in the idea of Russia and China and sort of what this war all means.
All right, thank you. I'm going to speak to some of the long-term implications regarding Russia's war in Ukraine vis-a-vis, well, first off, the Russian-Ukraine, but also Russian, United States, NATO, and then shortly Russia and China, to look at the long-term implications of this war as it proceeds into its third year. With regards to Russia and Ukraine, this conflict, I believe, whenever we're thinking about the war in Ukraine, we should understand it as a war about national identity. Putin initiated this war for the specific purpose of destroying Ukrainian national identity, any sense that the Ukrainians are people distinct from the Russians. Ukrainians are defending themselves to affirm that national identity. And I believe that this is a war that Russia, Putin, has already lost. As a matter of fact, I like to joke that I guarantee there will one day be a statue of Putin in Kyiv. But yes, see a little bit of surprise. But on the plinth of that statue is going to be written, Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin, the creator of modern Ukrainian national identity, because that's what's going on now. And that national identity is being expressed by a desire to reunite the country to its 1991 borders, especially regarding Crimea. And this is the second thing in the war between Russia and Ukraine we must think about is Crimea. We should think about Crimea's illegal annexation in 2014. In the same way now, when we go to our history books, we look at Germany's annexation of the Alsace-Lorraine in 1871 after the Franco-Prussian War, which made Germany and France implacable enemies for generations. And this is what has happened between the invasion of 2014 and 2022 between Russia and Ukraine. And this is especially true because Russia is fighting in those areas of Ukraine that up until this time had been favorably inclined to Moscow and were majority Russian speaking as the native language. But this is no more. Russian atrocities from Mariupol to Bakhmut and many other places in between, the destruction it's wrought across the country has destroyed that sense of Russophilia amongst that part of the Ukrainian population. That is why I believe, under current circumstances, there is no chance for negotiated settlement that would lead to a permanent peace between the two parties. And again, it goes back to Crimea. Neither party is going to give up Crimea or give up their claim to it. And I believe that this will only change when one of the two warring parties collapses. Russia is not going to change its external behavior until it changes internally. And Ukraine is not going to give up its claim on Crimea until either A, it's occupied by Russia, or B, it's totally abandoned by the West. Barring that, Ukraine will probably wait as long to retake Crimea as France waited to retake Alsace-Lorraine. And remember, the French had to take it back twice, 1918 and 1945. The importance for us is that this means that the Russian-Ukrainian conflict, be it hot or cold, is going to be Europe's overriding security issue for who knows when, for who knows how long. Now, when we talk about European security, naturally, we're going to talk about NATO and the United States. Besides this being a war about national identity, I think we should also see this as a war about civilizational and imperial identities. Russian national security elites have rejected the West and Western values, and instead have revived Russia's imperial identity, which says that it should be the natural hegemon over most of Eurasia. For the Kremlin, what I'm going to say is actually they joke about it, but this is the mindset for the Kremlin. Its neighbors can be independent, but cannot be sovereign. Meaning they cannot have agency to make their own decisions about their future, especially if those decisions contradict what Moscow would like. This was clearly outlined in Russia's diktat to the West in December 2021 as it was massing its armies on Ukraine's borders. Remember, its foreign ministry sent messages not to Kyiv, but to Brussels and to Washington, that for them to basically draw back, the NATO alliance would have to be dismantled east of the Elbe River, and that American nuclear weapons would have to be withdrawn totally from the European continent. And this would have meant that East and Central Europe would again be subject to Moscow's control. To achieve this war, Russia is waging a conventional war in Ukraine, but it's also conducting political warfare elsewhere. When I say political warfare, I mean use the old George Kennan definition of the use of all instruments of national power short of declared war for a political goal. And the goal in both wars being waged by the Russians is to undermine confidence in NATO as a viable military alliance, and also confidence in liberal democratic values that NATO defends. Moscow hopes to show that NATO cannot be counted on in the long run. And it's also learning, as part of its war in Ukraine, valuable lesson for their possible future operations and statecraft. And that is that masses of soldiers, masses of ammunition, and brutality not just towards the people it occupies, but also its own soldiers to spur them forward, works not just in gaining ground, but in making others fearful that this would happen to them. This strategy was successful in the former Soviet Republic of Georgia. Remember the 2008 invasion, which went just to the borders of the capital city of Tbilisi. And it may be applied again towards Moscow and its neighbors if it works in Ukraine. Depending on how Russian aggression succeeds on the battlefield in Ukraine and in subverting and undermining liberal democratic societies around it, this could be the war that Putin wins. Now, it's just a few short remarks about Russia-China. Despite everything going on, no matter how things turn out in the West, Russia is engaged in a war of attrition here in the West that's attriting its military power, its demographic power, its economic potential. While this is going on, China continues to grow stronger in the East, including, probably by the end of this decade, reaching parity in strategic nuclear weapons with both Russia and the United States. If you think about it, in terms of historical animosities, wide disbalance in military and economic power, demographic issues, et cetera, China and the West, China and not the West, should be Russia's primary national security preoccupation. However, since both Russia and China are dictatorships, the Russian national security elites do not fear China. They fear the Western states. They fear democracy because they see democracy as the one threat to their hold on power. This is exactly the same mistake that Stalin made. He trusted Hitler over what he considered the weak democratic states, even of the West, even though that Nazi Germany, as was proven in 1941, was a real existential threat to the Soviet Union. And I'd like to add this, despite what many people write, this image of a Sino-Russian alliance is, in my opinion, a mirage. Because as the war continues in the West, the imbalance of the correlation of forces continues in the East, much in favor of Beijing. And furthermore, Moscow's rejection of the West removes any incentive in the future for the West to serve as a geopolitical counterbalance to Chinese power if it ever decides to threaten Russia. And I believe that may be the greatest long-term consequence of the war. And I look forward to speaking more about this later on during our talk, both at strategic and the tactical level.
Well, Mitchell, I know that you prepared some slides, so we have that. And happy that you're going to bring in the European angle as well. So why don't you take it from there, and then we'll open it over to you.
Yeah, so I was asked to speak about this topic from the point of view of the European Union. And the European Union, similar to the United States, has been hugely supportive of Ukraine. So developments I think it's fair to say that in the United States, at the outset of the conflict, most Americans were super supportive of Ukraine. There was a lot of flag waving and demonstrations on college campuses, actually. And that enthusiasm seemed to sort of wane over time, to the point where our Congress refused to fund Ukraine at the beginning of this year, ultimately did vote support for Ukraine. But overall, public opinion seemed to wane in interest, and also to raise a lot more questions about why are we doing this? Like, why are we supporting Ukraine? In the European Union, it would be wrong to expect that the same trend is happening. In fact, the opposite is happening. So what's happened in the European Union, by and large, is that governments like that of France under Emmanuel Macron have become much more aggressive towards Russia, much more supportive of aid for Ukraine. So why this difference? Well, I think there's one obvious reason to that, is that Europe feels existentially threatened by Russia's invasion of Ukraine in a way that the United States public doesn't feel. And that's really an important message, I think, for all of us out to the public, is that I think for elites in the United States who deal with defense issues, see this as an existential threat in ways that was just mentioned, but the public doesn't as much. In Europe, it's quite the opposite. The public is hugely supportive of aid for Ukraine, continues to be, and the elites are actually getting more supportive over time, to the point that it was rumored that in a recent NATO summit, it was actually the French who were supporting NATO membership, or would have supported NATO membership for Ukraine, where it was with the Americans who actually backed away from that position. So you might ask, well, are there divisions in Europe? Are there some Europeans more enthusiastic and some less enthusiastic? Well, that's why I decided to bring my little handy chart. This comes from the Kiel Institute in Germany. That's an economic institute, but what this measures is the percent of GDP each country is spending on assistance to Ukraine. This assistance is both economic and military. I'll get to that in a second. But what it shows, a lot of times when we talk about Ukraine, we think of this as a sort of East-West division, right? So East Europe obviously is threatened by Russia, and West Europe is obviously less threatened by Europe, but that's not what this map shows. If you think, as I do, that the amount you're spending is a good reflection of how endangered you feel by Russia, then you'd have to look at this chart and say that actually it's more of a north-south split. That actually Northern Europe is much more mobilized and understanding of the Russian threat, And Southern Europe is a lot more sort of lackadaisical about that. And so if you look at it, the number one countries, I don't want to zap.
Unless it's going to work.
I don't think it's,
Oh, there you go.
it should work, yeah, but for some reason it's not showing up. Anyway. But you can see Finland and the Baltic states, as well as Denmark, are biggest supporters, along with Sweden, Norway, UK, Germany, that are really the backbone of support for Ukraine. Whereas it's really Spain, Italy, France that have been slower. And that obviously reflects, if you look at it geographically, the states around the Baltic Sea are obviously much more supportive of this, and that would include Germany, Poland, the Scandinavian countries, Denmark, etc. And then the North Sea would be the second place, and that just simply, well, one can imagine reasons for that. So that's the second point I wanted to make, and I think maybe I'll just say a word about national identity. There's a kind of question about what is the European Union actually? The European Union is not that well understood actually in the United States. I always complain at University of Pennsylvania, we really only have one course that teaches students about the European Union. So the European Union can be thought about in a lot of different ways, but I think one key aspect of it is that it's a way for countries to exercise their national identity, as was talked about. They can be Spanish, they can be Norwegian within the European Union, which fulfills some functions of, I guess, what used to be empires, right? That brings people together around a kind of security apparatus, a kind of economic cooperation. So it's a kind of paradoxical manner in which European nations feel the ability to be independent only within the European Union. So somewhat paradoxical. But I say that just to simply indicate that is how I think one can understand what's going on with Ukraine and the EU right now. That Ukraine is in the course of its risorgimento right now. It's in the course of its rebirth of its national identity. And it feels that identity can only be exercised within the scope of the European Union. And for that reason, the recognition that that is true on the European side is why the European Union has extended candidacy for membership, and in fact, open membership negotiations with Ukraine. So what we're seeing also is a big shift in the borders of Europe, also towards the north and towards the east, as a result of this war. I just want to conclude by talking about I wanted to conclude by the question of, is Europe capable? So does Europe now, I've argued, strongly supports Ukraine. This is, by the way, another chart that shows public opinion in 23 and 24 by Eurobarometer, which shows massive public support for humanitarian assistance to Ukraine, for welcoming Ukrainian refugees, over 80%, about 72% supporting sanctions on Russia. Providing financial support to Ukraine is also 70%. Military equipment, less so, but still over 60% of the population in Europe is supportive, as opposed to about 30 something. So it's almost double the amount. But, when it comes to what type of support, flip to the next slide here. You see that the EU support tends to be more on well, first of all, the EU is providing actually more support right now than the United States. This is also less known, but I think in accord with my view that Europe is more existentially threatened. It's now vastly beyond the United States in terms of the amount of support. However, the support tends to be predominantly financial and government support. It's supporting the activities of the government, whereas the US remains the largest military donor. So there's a question, could Europe support Ukraine on its own without the United States, which was a question we really faced earlier this year. And the answer is possibly, in partly, but of course the military industries in Europe are not yet really prepared to provide a lot of the equipment that we use. But I'll just end on this thought that when it comes down to manpower, I think Europe is committed enough. Many European countries, I would say, are committed enough at this point that they do not want to see Ukraine lose. And when it comes down to a decision about what that means, it could be easier, paradoxically, for Europe to put troops on the ground, for European countries to put troops on the ground than to send over more artillery. Because at the end of the day, I think that it's sort of harder to justify, harder to get somehow the gears of building up this industry together. But if you're really committed, putting troops on the ground is a symbol of that commitment, and it's also in a way something that's a little more saleable somehow, or a little more doable for European governments. I don't see every government doing that, but I just would say that there's a risk of that.
Well, that concludes the, thank you for that.
Please.
That concludes the formal prepared remarks, and I have a few questions that I'll tee up. But the first one is, you failed to mention, Rob, that you do visit Ukraine pretty frequently, quarterly. Phil, have you gone yet, or you're
I
planning?
was there last year.
You were there last year too. So
Give me more money and I'll go there this year.
So we have two people on this panel who's actually been in country. I'm going to start with Rob, and then I'll come to you, Phil. Can you explain how dependent the Ukrainian military has become on US and Western assistance? So from your first trip, you went 2023 or 2023, your first trip, to your last trip, which I think was about 3 months ago. And so how has that played out as you have been visiting on your research?
Sure. So one thing to keep in mind when we look at the entire war is that the first month or two, the Ukrainian military was equipped with older systems, or Soviet-era systems, or Ukrainian-made systems. They had very limited NATO systems. Once we got into the spring of 2022, ammunition started to become a problem for Ukraine for a variety of systems, but including artillery. And so NATO started providing a variety of artillery pieces from a variety of countries, including the US, but a number of European countries. And it was important for the artillery systems themselves, which are generally better quality, more accurate, better range. But it was very important because it was a different type of ammunition, right? It was NATO 155 millimeter artillery ammunition, which Ukraine did not. I don't think they had any 155 millimeter howitzers before them. And that was the ammunition we had to provide, right? NATO did not have much in the way of Soviet-era ammunition. So a lot of this was not simply they needed the equipment, it was more they needed equipment that can fire our ammunition. That remains a very important factor. So I think the US still provides about 80% of Ukraine's artillery ammunition needs. It's very, very high, which is why when the US had reduced aid packages over the winter and spring, this is such a significant issue for Ukraine, because before the war, I think, and there's some legitimate questions about to what extent Europe was properly maintaining its defense industry and militaries. There's clearly been a lot of focus in European countries to help Ukraine in this war, but they often didn't have the same kind of defense industrial base or stockpiles of weapons to provide the US did. And so that's why US system was so important and remains very important. Another issue is that some weapon systems are only produced in the US, or the ammunition is only produced in the US. So if the US cuts off, the provision of that equipment, Europe can't make up for that, right? So Patriot systems, I think they're all produced in the US. I think the missiles are produced in the US. And that is a really key component of the air defense capabilities for Ukraine right now. So Ukraine is still very dependent on Western aid for ammunition, for equipment, for a variety of things. Many of the countries, right, provide certain systems that only that country provides. And so we get a collective, action issue if not all the countries are providing the same level of aid, or you have one, in this case, the U.S. becomes, a country that, stops providing that aid. And we obviously have a presidential election coming up, and that could decide, a significant, have a significant influence on the military factors for Ukraine going forward if the U.S. provides greater or provides kind of less aid going forward. So U.S. aid is still critical. NATO Western aid is still critical. And I think one thing that became very clear this year, particularly I think in Europe, is that this war was an existential war. And Phil mentioned this earlier for Ukraine. Russia had maximalist objectives that was very clear in 2022. And then we saw Russia's initial invasion fail. And then we saw all these different mistakes that Russia made. and that Ukraine was able to take back the initiative at the end of 2022 and achieve really significant victories in Kherson and Kharkiv. 2023 was a much tougher year for Ukraine, and I think a lot of people in Europe and elsewhere maybe forgot this was still an existential war for Ukraine. And then over this winter, when Ukraine ran into really serious manpower problems, at the same time when the U.S. was not providing enough ammunition aid, I think that became it became more kind of tangible for many Europeans, for governments, for the European countries, that basically this war is still existential for Ukraine, and that Ukraine could lose if the U.S. completely cuts off aid, and that the only way that Ukraine would survive in that case is if Europe increases its production and starts to try and meet these other needs. And so I think that kind of resonated more the last few months, that this war could go different directions, and there are many kind of variables that could lead to that and adjust that. But Western aid is still one of the really critical factors for Ukraine, because Ukraine is very dependent on foreign aid for essentially almost all its military needs.
So, Phil, that raises something that you talked about, the likelihood that this war will continue until there's a victor. And so the reason why I asked Rob to go first is because he's laid out the dependencies that Ukraine now has on us and Europe. We'll come to Europe in a second. And so in your estimation, are we prepared to continue? And is there not a natural tension between their dependencies on the West, their potential war aims, and potential war fatigue as it comes into our own country in supporting of the Ukrainians moving forward?
All right, let me answer that with first off looking at what Ukraine has now, and then are we prepared to continue to support them? And I'll answer that. One is military industrial base, but also political will. So Ukraine, as Rob was saying, when the war started, I mean, what we have here are almost like two very close armies fighting each other. Very close in language, very close in history, very close in their military organization. They're basically two post-Soviet forces going at each other with Soviet equipment. That's still the case for Russia, but now the case with Ukraine is they are transforming themselves into NATO equipment, which means not only are they fighting the war, but they've basically had to take their entire military and change it from a Soviet to a Western military in a matter of months. And this includes logistics, the maintenance, support. There's an old saying that amateurs talk tactics, pros talk logistics. Well, they talk logistics and maintenance. And these are the key things. Now, there are good things and bad things. As Rob has said, most of the Western equipment is better than the Soviet equipment. And one of the things that's really good on it, especially for tanks, armored vehicles, and that is crew survivability. And so this has been a great advantage for the Ukrainians, who again are not like the Russians, who are willing to take the casualties and can take some of the casualties they've been doing over the past 2 years. But it's a two-edged sword. They're now dependent on us. There are no 155 millimeter artillery shell factories in Ukraine. So whether they're going to win or not is going to depend on us, and whether we're going to be able to provide them that support, ammunition, maintenance, artillery barrels. An artillery piece, even though I'm an infantryman, I know this because I was once in mortars, an artillery piece will last about 7,000 rounds. And again, depending on what charge you fire and all of that. I see there's some artillerymen in the background. Those people are gonna have to speak to real loudly. Most of those barrels, so you've got to be new barrels. Otherwise, that thing becomes basically a smooth bore weapon and not very accurate. These are sorts, besides just ammunition, these are the sorts of things. The recoil pads and that need to be replaced. And the same with tanks, with armored personnel carriers, with aircraft, the F-16s when they finally arrive. All of this is going to require us to help them with both the actual parts and the advice to let them maintain their military. Can we do that? We have found out just how poorly prepared our own military industrial base is. For this, we owe Ukraine a debt of thanks, because like in 1939 or even 1914, when the war began in Europe, America has time to start rebuilding it. We've made progress. We're a far way from getting there. And as opposed to 1914, 1939, the types of weapons you could produce there, today's modern weapons take a long time to build. They are very, require very specific types of small, integrated circuits and all of this. It's not just like producing an artillery shell, a Patriot missile, the air defense, all the other equipment that is sent over takes time to build and has to be, the high-tech weapon is just not turned out like you can turn out the bullets. So this in itself is a difficulty. The fact that we do not give long-term contracts to our military industrial base, our companies, so that they can plan for 10 years in advance is another disadvantage. It's a structural disadvantage in our democracy. Okay, but it's there. So that's another disadvantage. We must produce enough also to replace our own stocks of what we've given Ukraine. There are laws of how far the Pentagon can go down in certain stocks. And that the president has to, if you go down further, he's got to inform the Congress and make a decision. So there's other limits in there. So we're improving our production. We're getting better at this. We have got a long ways to go. The question is, are we going to continue with the political will? And I'm not going to speak about either party in this. This is, FPRI, we're nonpartisan. We're apolitical. But I'll just posit this. Right now, there are two theories of the case. And one theory is that we should just, force them to make peace, make them sacrifice some territory for peace. We need the equipment. We need to equip our own forces. We don't have time to give the money. We've got other priorities. This is one theory of the case. Okay, it'll be voted upon in November. Another theory is we'll help Ukraine as long as it takes, but it never says the words so it wins and Russia loses. And it has provided aid incrementally and in limited amounts. So not enough. I mean, all possible help up to, but not actually including, real aid so that Ukraine can win. Those two positions are very far apart, yet when you come to results, they're pretty close together. So what we're going to see is whether in the next year or so, policy is going to come about that is going to help Ukraine so that it can have the material and the resources necessary to actually defeat the Russians and not just hold them off at arm's length. So I hope that answers your question.
Good.
Can I jump in real quick?
Real quick, no,
So I didn't answer this before, but Ukraine's defense industry is also developing. There are some things they don't really produce. They are increased production of howitzers, armored vehicles. UAVs is the obvious one, right? Where they're producing tactical FPVs, kind of kamikaze UAVs, long-range UAVs, the strike targets in Russia that are not allowed to use Western weapons to do so, and a variety of the kind of things, as well as like electronic warfare. But ultimately, ammunition production is not sufficient. There are a number of things they were going to still rely on Western countries to provide. The one kind of good news is that although many Western countries waited to invest in increasing production capacity of ammunition, those increases will probably begin to really pick up in 2025. And so even though Russia had a number of advantages this year because they invested in mobilizing their economy sooner, many of those, I think, advantages will decrease relatively in 2025. And I think that right now the estimate is that by, I think, basically from a year from now, the U.S. will be producing around 90,000 155 millimeter howitzer rounds or artillery rounds per month, which will provide Ukraine a pretty decent number. Europe is also moving up in that direction as well, so that will give Ukraine a better ability to defend and fight against Russia.
So turning to Europe, I was struck by your chart about the North-South divide. One of the standard tactics of the Soviet Union and the Russians is obviously to drive a wedge in international organizations, whether that be in NATO or whether that be in the European Union between member states about how to deal with it. So when you look at Europe, you may see widespread levels of support for Ukraine, much like Phil was talking about here, but differences in opinion about challenges that may arise. And one thing here is, I think, concerns about escalation further, particularly around French President Macron's continued, we're going to send troops in, we're going to start training Ukrainians in Ukraine with French advisors. So can you speak to a little bit about some of the sort of more granular challenges Europe may face as they move forward in dealing with an open-ended conflict?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the premise is absolutely right. There's a widespread agreement in Europe that it's the right thing to do to support Ukraine. But when it comes to how much you're going to support or in what ways, there's big differences opinion. I think that France, so if you looked at that chart before, Germany, which had been insulted for, not really having, for Chancellor Scholz announced at the beginning of the war, we're having a Zeitenwende, a turning point in German affairs. We're going to fund $100 billion, to increase the size of German army. And people were like, well, where did any of that actually happen? Or is it just a declaratory goal? We now see that they're the number 2 military spender in Ukraine. And so there is some reality to that. I think France has taken longer to come around. But we do see signs from French point of view. I think, well, we do see signs of them increasing support for Ukraine, but also defending their own territory, right? So France's military strategy had been external, to have mobile warfare, being able to reach Africa particularly, but any spot really. They were the one European army able to do that, but now they're thinking about, okay, territorial defense is an issue. By the way, not only an issue vis-a-vis Russia, but also to some extent vis-a-vis Poland and Germany too. Not in the sense that they're expecting Poland and Germany to invade, but simply that if the Polish military becomes bigger and the German military becomes bigger and France doesn't, that changes the balance of power inside of the European Union in ways that France, who's always liked to assert its leadership role, would find uncomfortable. So I think that there are big differences. We don't know how they're going, but all signs right now are pointing to more and more European commitment, including in the military space. And I again would say that with regards to, well, 2 things: Macron's comments that we would maybe should talk about putting troops. I think he's quite serious about that, and I think that's an issue in the upcoming French parliamentary elections, which are going to come on the heels of this bad showing of his party in the European elections for the European Parliament. He was trounced by the far right Rassemblement National, and he is called snap elections as a result. I think to get people in France to rethink, okay, is this what we want? Is this who we want in charge? And the Rassemblement the Le Penist party has always been more pro-Russia. Whether they continue to be so, remains a little unclear. There are divisions in the far right in general in Europe, with the Italian far right party of Meloni being pro-Ukraine and pro-NATO, and the Le Penist party being having a history of being anti-NATO and pro-Russia. So I think the French voters are going to be allowed to vote on that pretty soon. We're going to see, again, a testing of the voters are going to tell a little bit about the strategy. But at the same time, we're talking about for Europe in the context of real existential risks, where that people actually feel, the voters feel, and that all the parties feel to some extent.
Leave it to France to have both the Olympic Games and a parliamentary election in the same month. Good for them. At this point, we can turn it over to audience questions. Do you have a mic, Christine? We're gonna, so everybody can hear. We have a mic that we'll pass around. I see Dom in the front row, so kick us off.
Sure. Thanks. Dominic Tierney, Swarthmore College. So my question is about Crimea, and whether this is the kind of Achilles heel of the Russian war effort. And it sort of goes to the point about professionals focus on logistics, and whether the smart Ukrainian focus should be on making Russia's logistical position in Crimea an impossible one. They've hit air defenses. There's talk of, hitting the bridge, going after the railways, going after the barges. So I guess 2-part question. Is it possible for Ukraine to make Russia's position in Crimea an impossible one? And if that is substantively true, what's the implication of that for the war? Could that lead Putin to seriously think about negotiating, escalating? Is that the game changer? Ukraine doesn't need to do a huge offensive operation. It just needs to make this Russian weakness more real. Tell me a bit about Crimea.
Does anybody else want to toss in a question before I turn it back to the panelists?
I was harboring that, I was thinking of asking a very similar question as to why the Ukrainians, which have shown tremendous, asymmetric capabilities, especially maritime. And why don't they really go after the bridge, the Kursk bridge, and take it out? Not just damage it. It seems to me that that would be an incredible propaganda victory for them, propaganda defeat for Putin domestically, if they were to do that. And it would achieve the end, or it help to achieve the end that this gentleman has suggested might be critical.
You want to start, and then Rob will come to you?
I'll start off first. That which you are suggesting, the Ukrainians are doing and have been doing for a while now. First off, Sevastopol, the historic anchorage of the Black Sea Fleet, which should probably now be called Black Sea Squadron, because it's been so attrited, is no more. Ukrainian grain imports and exports are now the same as they were before the war. Okay. Russia has lost control of the Black Sea, cannot do any sort of naval interdiction. Attacks using long-range missiles provided by the West have been attriting both Russian air defenses in Crimea, radar sites, probably in preparation for when F-16s become operational, not to mention other logistical hubs. There have also been some sabotage operations against the rail line going through there. And you are correct. They have also been attriting the maritime infrastructure that would be needed if or when the bridge is destroyed. The LSTs, barges, railroad barges, and others, so that when that bridge does go down, they're not going to have a plan B to be able to supply. Now, what's the significance of this? For the Russians maintaining the fleet, let's take a look at the people they have on Kherson at the very end of their supply lines. Right now, from their major supply dump in Rostov, and I wrote about this in that article, and Rostov on Don, going over the bridge. Most of this will come railway, because the Russians are railway centric for the logistics, although they've improved in other ways. From Rostov on Don to the railway, up to the people on the front line to Kherson, 240 miles. Okay, that's basically driving from Philadelphia to Altoona. I looked it up last night. That bridge goes down from Rostov on down, now along the strip of land along the Sea of Azov, up to those front lines in Kherson, opposite south of the Dnieper River, is over 512 miles. In other words, driving from Philadelphia to Toledo, Ohio. And then you got to turn around and go back and then get the next load and bring it on up. So that's the effect that dropping the bridge will have. It's not easy to do. It's not like in the movies you show a guy take 4 or 5 highway flares, put it under, then you see this huge explosion. Bridges like this size take tons of explosives, and then they can be repaired, to destroy. They can be repaired. So it's not an easy thing to do. It can be done. But what I wanted to stress is that the Ukrainians are doing what we would call preparation of the battlefield to hit at the logistics, because as Bob said, yes, the Russians have been able to build up an army, a larger army than they started the war with, but large armies must be supplied. And the Achilles heel, as you said, is in every army is logistics. And right now, the Ukrainian strategy seems to be hitting their air defense, hitting their airfields, hitting their air defense radars, this fleet anchorage in Sevastopol, the fleet anchorage in Novorossiysk, and other areas to make Crimea untenable. And then the piece de resistance is going to be if they're able to drop that bridge at the Kerch Straits and then complicate their logistical issues even more. With that, I'll turn it over to Rob.
So I'm a little less optimistic, unfortunately. So I'd say politically, obviously the Kerch Bridge was struck in October of 2022, right? And it was a number of the sections were destroyed, and there was a big explosion. I think when we talk about what is politically significant for Putin has such a control in Russia that I wouldn't say it's total, but where are the big protests? right? And they did a large mobilization in September 2022, protests for a week. They were literally getting people sending them to the front line with very little support, little training, getting people killed immediately. Just, pretty mild protests. So I'm not sure I can predict that this one single event will be the cause that will lead to some kind of really significant political repercussions for Putin. Because I think, domestically, I think most Russians are, indifferent or maybe even somewhat positively inclined to the war at this point, at some level. I'm not sure striking the bridge would have that much of a political effect. I think we talk about the overall situation. So Ukraine received Storm Shadow missiles before the offensive last summer, right? And they fired hundreds of these missiles. Russia shoots down a good number of these missiles. I don't have a good figure for you, but they are shooting down a number of them. So we shouldn't expect every missile to hit a target. It's less than that. Obviously, they've done a lot of damage. They've hit a number of Russian ships. They've hit other bridges. Storm Shadows are not the best missile for taking on the Kerch Bridge, which is why they've not used them that way. ATACMS, which they received, are a better option, but are still not the ideal option. The ideal option is the German Taurus, which Germany has not provided, and Germany, I don't think, wants to be associated with taking down the Kerch Bridge, possibly because of political issues. And so there isn't a perfect option for Ukraine in terms of long-range missiles. You can damage the bridge, but as Phil was saying, if they can repair it in a month, is that worth however many missiles it takes, right? And some of these missiles would be shot down and so on. Also keep in mind, much of the logistics that goes to different parts of occupied areas does not go through Crimea, right? They use the bridge, but a lot of it goes through, either train networks through the occupied areas or by vehicles. One of the adaptations Russia made in 2022, 2023, when HIMARS arrived, is they stopped using these huge ammo depots near the front line. And instead, they started, one, pushing them back, but also increasingly relying on trucks. So trucks will pick up artillery ammunition in rail depots far from the front line. So in Rostov-on-Don and Crimea, they'll bring it into a transfer point into occupied areas where regimental trucks will pick it up and bring it to the front line. That's the inefficient way of doing business, but it means there isn't the same kind of great target that will have a significant immediate effect with these missile strikes. Since the U.S. moved right at ATACMS, the long-range ATACMS, we've seen a number of Russian air defense systems be damaged, destroyed. I don't know the full numbers, but they are clearly going after S-300, S-400 systems. They have struck a number of valuable targets in occupied areas. The issue is that all of this together, when we talk about making Crimea untenable, we can make it difficult for Russia to have certain military objects in Crimea, but is that going to force people to leave? I'm not so sure about that. Also, the Crimean Bridge, I think, was built in 2018. Before that, was all ferries. So yes, it does look as though Ukraine hit some of these ferries with ATACMS. But when we talk about how well can Ukraine, make Crimea less tenable, it likely requires a large number of these missiles and repetitive, sustained strikes over a period of time to keep going after ferries, to keep going after other things. Does UK and France have enough, Storm Shadows and scalps for that? I don't know. I'm not sure we have enough ATACMS. These are kind of legitimate questions. Looking forward, years down the line, this could happen over time. I would say that we shouldn't be. I'm a little bit less optimistic that it'll have that effect by itself. Ultimately, if Ukraine is to take back this territory, it needs to be done with a large offensive. So it could be these missile strikes in support of a larger ground operation. But right now, Ukraine doesn't have offensive potential to do something like that. And of course, we saw last summer when Ukraine had a number of new brigades. They received hundreds of these Storm Shadow missiles. It was still extremely difficult to break through Russian lines. And the Russian military is bigger now than it was in the summer of 2023. So, I don't want to be the pessimistic guy here, but a lot of things can go wrong, right, or go right. Russia's made a number of terrible mistakes in this war. I would not be surprised to make another number of terrible mistakes in this war. But for Ukraine to really take back a lot more territory, I think it will depend on Russia making some really significant errors, overextending, or having some kind of difficulty just managing the war itself. I'm not sure missile strikes alone will be sufficient to achieve that.
We have about 5 minutes left. Does anybody have a question? Gentleman in the back there.
Thank you. I guess you talked about the Ukrainian lack of or the disadvantage in terms of troop numbers. you know, it's, I guess, Prigozhin, his uprising was however many months ago already. They just got rid of their defense minister. Talk about the Russian troops. How trained are they now? They're taking, I mean, whatever the casualty rate, they're taking a lot of casualties. Are they as motivated? Are they as well trained? And is that an issue in the war, or is it just pure numbers? And then separately, I'm just curious if anyone has comments on Russia just got some more ships to Cuba that's being downplayed. Is that something that is really noteworthy?
Sure. So there's a selection bias issue here because I taught the Ukrainian soldiers who are fighting. I do not taught the Russian soldiers who are fighting, and they wouldn't tell me anything. So my interpretation is a little more difficult there. This war is a very tough war, right? And I think we've forgotten. I was an infantryman. I fought in Afghanistan, but it was a much easier war to fight in Afghanistan, right? And I was there. I knew that I had a date where I was going to leave and I was going to be going home, right? All the people who were fighting this war, some of whom have been fighting about 2.5 years, have been fighting a much more intense war with very
It's on the Ukrainian side.
Ukraine, yeah, Ukraine, maybe some on the Russian side too. And so it's an extremely difficult war. Every day it's much kind of more difficult to deal with it, and little rotation. There's no end date. That's tough on the Ukrainian side. On the Russian side, I think it's it's worse, right? So they are getting volunteers because they provided pretty good financial benefits. Average sort of the Russian average salary. But at the same time, they're using very draconian measures to enforce discipline and to get people to go into operations. So executions are more common at the front line. This is something that Wagner was doing last year. Now the Russian military is doing it more often. One of the big findings I had in my last trip in February, March is that talk to people across the front line in Ukraine that they know of indications or examples of squad leaders, platoon commanders being able or authorized to execute soldiers if they don't go into assaults. And that's how I think partially how they're getting these people to go into assaults. That is obviously not ideal, but it can be semi-effective in order to get, to operate with a kind of quantity. There are a lot of issues there, right? And of course, this comes back to how long is that sustainable? It's kind of this insane thing to think about where people are volunteering for such a horrible situation. And if you go into assaults, right, the risk of being killed or wounded is very, very high, as we can see. Russia is absolutely taking very heavy casualties in assaults. They have not made significant gains the last 6-7 months, even though they had all these advantages. And the rate of loss, I don't think, is sustainable. When that actually happens, though, is hard to kind of predict because when is Russia going to run out of manpower? When it will become a political issue, I don't know. Right now, they are recruiting a lot of people. It looks as though they've been recruiting enough to cover their losses. They may need to mobilize again, so that's a possibility. But then again, politically, is another mobilization. Is that politically unpalatable for Putin to do? I'm not so sure it is. So I don't have a great kind of answer for everything here. I would not want to be serving the Russian military in this war. I am surprised they keep getting so many people to volunteer for this. Maybe they don't know the actual conditions, but ultimately, they're managing to get guys to go into assaults, even if they're resorting to very draconian measures to do so.
For the Russian side, and this is based on a number of things, by reading the Russian Telegram channels, other social media, conversations I had with Ukrainian officers last summer. The Russians are operating with three things. As Rob said, first off, brutality. So it's like the old World War II, the NKVD, the secret police was behind your units. If you retreated, you were machine gunned by your own people. Great scene of that in opening scenes of the movie on Stalingrad, Enemy at the Gates. Okay, second off is compensation, like Bob also mentioned. I mean, there was a great study done by Jamestown Foundation, not to mention a rival think tank, that showed it actually makes sense to go and die because your family will be taken care of. If you're from a remote area in Russia, your family with the death benefits, if they're paid, will be taken care of. So that's the second thing. Third is the young Russian men or the older Russian men who were fighting, many of them actually believed propaganda. Well, they arrived in Izium. They told the Ukrainian lady, "We're here to free you from the Nazis." And she was like, "Oh, what Nazi? You're the Nazis." But many of them actually believe that they are fighting on sacred Russian soil. So those three things together. However, the enemy is, as Rob said, things on the other side of the hill, they have their own problems, just as Ukrainians have. And Rob has pointed out very succinctly. I'm not sure how long they'll be able to sustain this. None of us know. When we're looking at the Russians, we have to remember, though, we're looking at a quite different culture. Ukrainian culture is changing very much to a Western culture. The Russian culture is staying the same. That is a culture that did not experience the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, the Reformation, and other things that separate West from East. And I have a very good, two good friends of mine, both now retired CIA as well, one case officer who dealt with Russians almost his entire career. And he says they may look like us, and we're used to, like, because they look like us, thinking they're just like us, but it's like dealing with any other different culture. And when we're thinking about how long the Russians can survive, we need to think that it's a different culture, and a culture that prides itself on suffering. The second thing, however, though, is my other good friend, who was a Russian military analyst for years in his career. He's been tracking. We exchange emails regularly, and he's just still looking at the losses. And in May, in this Kharkiv offensive, it's the heaviest losses. It's twice what they were losing in 2022, 2023 in the summer in those heavy battles. And doing some simple, back of the envelope math, they're now losing, if they keep this up, they're losing more than they're bragging about recruiting. And we have to also treat Russian statistics very warily. But we will see. This year is going to be very important. We cannot, been involved, and Rob is too, in events where you just wish you could press the fast forward button and see how this turns out. Well, there's no fast forward button in here to see how this is going to turn out in the end. But the Russians have some problems. If anything, what may save them and their troops, because as a Marine officer, former retired Marine officer, I'm thinking in my mind too, how would I be motivating men under these conditions where they don't mutiny? And we've already seen one mutiny. And the answer, one of my analyst friend came up, is these guys are not on the front lines long enough to live to get pissed off, because their life expectancy is about a week in some cases. It's been Russian analysts have shown this. So there's a lot of different variables we can't predict. And I'll just end with this. It's like this can of Coke. We see right here what it's made up of. However, no one outside of the people in Atlanta actually know how to do this, because it's produced under certain pressures and temperatures and that to create the Coke. Well, that's the same thing. We don't know the certain pressures and temperatures and all that that's going to cause either the Russians to be victorious or the Russians to fall apart. And that's, my answer to that. It remains to be seen which way it's going to go, because both armies are under incredible stresses in in the largest conventional war Europe has seen since 1945. I'll end that.
Well, I think we've gone over by 5 minutes, but we can do one more question, and then we'll.
It's a quick follow-up, another follow-up question, but this pertains to the Russian officer corps. And I remember reading, it wasn't precisely a study. I think it actually was sourced from a Russian pro-war blog, that the Russian officer corps is comprised of a surprisingly high percentage of Ukrainian or culturally bound Ukrainian officers. I don't remember what the statistic was, but it was north of 50% had Ukrainian roots, ancestral, and I'm just wondering if that situation still exists. Well, first of all, if it was accurate, and secondly, does that situation still exist, and is it exploitable?
You guys actually have an answer for that, Rob?
Sure. There are still a number of senior Russian officers who were born in Ukraine. But I'd say keep in mind, many Russians who were born in other parts of the Soviet Union still identify as Russian. So some of these, if these, for example, if these were the children of military officers stationed there, right, they may still identify as Russian or there. Obviously, this is, I think, more common in areas that are maybe occupied now. So areas of the Donbass that might have had more kind of pro-Russian views. I think people, when they join the Russian military and make it a career, they become part of Russia, right? They identify with Russia, and there's a Russian general who is I think his family's from Dagestan. I forget. His name is Rustam Muradov, who was relieved earlier, I think last year. But he was put in charge of the Russian peacekeeping contingent in Armenia, Azerbaijan, and it became an issue initially when he was sent there about his family being from the Caucasus and whether or not they had some kind of familial influence that might influence how he acted as a commander of peacekeepers. And I remember my friends, Russian friends of mine who I know, and they basically said these people are part of the system, right? Once you're in the military, once you're a careerist, they're part of Russia. During the Wagner mutiny, we didn't see Russian military's mutiny. We didn't see anyone. We saw units that maybe didn't respond, but not that I think rebelled that kind of way. So I don't think it's something that's going to something that's easy to kind of pull these guys away. And I think they are they're Russian and they kind of support the system. And I think there's maybe a more surprising degree is that how many Russian generals have gone along with the plans in this war, right? And didn't kind of step up at all these different times. There is a Russian general being tried right now in prison for who got relieved last summer, and an interesting case. But overall, I'm not sure it's that significant of an issue.
Well, with that, the significant issue is the time. And so we're going to end the session right now. I want to thank everybody for attending, thank our speakers.